From Genesis 21, the Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time God had told him. Abraham named his son who was born to him, the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, drive out this slave with her son, for the son of this slave will not be a co-heir with my son Isaac. Verse 14. Early in the morning, Abraham got up, took bread and a water skin, put them on Hagar's shoulders, and sent her and the boy away. She left and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she left the boy under one of the bushes and went and sat at a distance, about a bowshot away, for she said, I can't bear to watch the boy die. While she sat at a distance, she wept loudly. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God came to Hagar, called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying from the place where he is. Get up, help the boy up, and grasp his hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. So she went and filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew. He settled in the wilderness and became an archer. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. At that time, Abimelech, accompanied by Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Swear to me by God here and now that you will not break an agreement with me or with my children and descendants. As I have been loyal to you, so you will be loyal to me and to the country where you are a resident alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. Verse 31. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because it was there that the two of them swore an oath. After they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham lived as an alien in the land of the Philistines for many days. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning again, church. It is always good to see your faces and hear you guys singing and gather, especially on weeks like this. So if you've talked to me at length this morning, you might know this already. But this week has been kind of hard, so I'm like in a really weird spot. So I don't normally just start my sermon off by telling you guys that up front. But this week has been just challenging in some ways. Some of it's just the busyness of life, but some of it's more discouraging things. And so if I feel scattered today, it's because I probably am. So I have felt scattered all week, and so this sermon might be a little bit scattered. But I am thankful for all of you, first of all, that we have a culture where I don't have to put on a face like we hope any of you don't have to either, no matter how you come in. And so that's why we read the welcome that we do at the beginning. Just because I'm in a pastoral role doesn't mean that life is just great all the time. And so I want you to know that I feel incredible freedom. I don't feel pressure, and that is a testament to each of you guys that we just are who we are. And so I'm just kind of putting that up front. If you're here regularly, you know that I don't normally start off that way, but that's just where I'm at today. And so I'm grateful for those of you that remind me of gospel truths that I need to hear week after week, because I need them just as much as any of us. So normally I start off with some great illustration. I had thought of one and didn't have the energy to think about how to put it in the sermon. So just plug in here a illustration about the song I Swear by All for One or John Michael Montgomery, and that'll tell you what kind of music you listen to, and I'll judge you based on which version you know best. But you can plug in something there about I swear, because the text has swearing in it and oaths and all this stuff. So there's your opening illustration. So hope that hooked you in like it's supposed to. So Genesis 21 is where we're at today. You did hear a lot of the text read. Feel free to follow along. We typically use the CSB version. And when we're in these bigger chunks, I just have to kind of bounce and summarize a little bit. But if you're following along, you can kind of see where we're at. And I'll try to reference the verses as we go along. A little bit of a roadmap for our text. The text is broken up into three kind of main sections. And so I have three main truths about God that we're going to learn from each of those. And so let me just give you those up front, and then we'll kind of work our way through them. So verses 1 through 6 are about the fulfillment of God's promise through the birth of the promised son Isaac. So we've been following that narrative for a while now. And so my truth for that section is this: God is celebration for those who wait. So that's that first section. The next section is verses 7 all the way through 21. And that follows Hagar and Ishmael as they are permanently kicked out of Abraham's household. And through these verses, we'll see that God is comfort for those who wander. Comfort for those who wander. And then the rest of the chapter, which is verses 22 through 34, they tell us a story about Abraham further settling in the land of the Philistines in a place called Beersheba. And in these verses, we will learn that God is confidence for those who wonder. He is confidence for those who wonder. So I know I said I didn't have time to be creative, but that's pretty creative. So not really, it just worked out. So let's start by looking at the truth from our first movement, verses 1 through 6. God is celebration for those who wait. We heard it read. Let's read verses 1 through 2 one more time to get us into the text. It says, "The Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time God had told him." So I know we've been going through this narrative fairly quickly, and if you're reading Genesis, it seems to go by quick, but this is 25 years since God first appeared to Abraham. So 25 years of waiting on the delivery of the promise. We've been through a disaster of them trying to figure it out on their own. We've seen the agony and the doubt and the longing and the wondering, but after all of this, after 25 years, God did just as he said, what he had promised at the appointed time he said he would. The text makes it clear that this is God's work from start to finish, that he is the one who made this happen. Through the windings and the ups and downs of the Genesis narrative, the one thing that has been consistent is the character and faithfulness of God, and he comes through. We're told that he comes to Sarah and she miraculously gives birth. The word here is that God visited Sarah. He shows up intentionally and in power, and he fulfills the promise concerning both Abraham and Sarah and confirming to them that he is good on his word. We've seen this before in Genesis, but when God says he's going to do something, it is as good as done. In verses 3 to 4, we're told that Abraham, he responds in obedience, first of all, by naming the child Isaac, which means he laughs, and we'll see the significance of that in a second. So he names the child Isaac, and secondly, he circumcises Isaac on the 8th day. He's given to him the covenant sign, back when we saw chapter 17, the covenant sign that he was to give to all the children born in his household. And I love this because we're told in verse 5 that Abraham around this time is 100 years old. So a couple things that's doing, that's moving us along in the narrative, but it's also helping us see his sanctification journey. I mean, if you're not 100 yet, there's still hope for you in this life, right? What I mean here is that through the ups and downs, Abraham, he's made his mistakes and he will make more, but through grace alone, he is still being sanctified and brought to this place of obedience and trust as God has proven himself faithful down through the years. As I once heard an elderly saint say to a younger saint, "I don't have any more faithfulness than you. I just have more experience with a faithful God." And I'm personally thankful, and I mean this a lot, for those of you in here who have walked through the Christian life much longer than I. And on weeks like this specifically, allow me to borrow from some of your faith and your trust because you've seen God work, even as you've waited over years. And so we see Abraham's sanctification journey, but we also see Sarah's journey. Remember, we've seen her mess things up at this point in the story, but we've also kind of empathized with her. Her identity in this ancient Near Eastern culture comes primarily from bearing children. She had been barren her whole life. Even when she directly heard God say that she would have a son, she incredulously laughs, most likely in disbelief. But now, all of the questions, all of the doubt, all of the longing fades into the distance as she looks into the face of her newborn. And she can't help but smile. She can't help but respond in joyful worship. Look at what she says in verse 6. This is her response. She says, "God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me." She sees the irony of the meaning of Isaac's name, which means that he will laugh or he will bring laughter. and recognizes that God is a God who takes those who have sat in the waiting, who, if you're like me, like when I'm in discouraged times, I start with like low-level discouragement, and the next thing is I just make fun of everything and I find laughter in everything. Like I just laugh incredulous, like I can't believe this is happening. It's a laughter of unbelief, right? Like, oh my gosh. But he takes this laughter of disbelief and he turns it into a laughter of joy and dancing. Truly, God does bring celebration to those who wait. Later, as this story would be recounted to the nation of Israel, it would have been encouraging for them. As they heard of God visiting Sarah is the language that is used in their waiting. In fact, the book of Genesis ends with Joseph saying, hey, one day you're going to be enslaved in Egypt, but hold on, God is going to visit you. It's the same exact language here, and redeem you and rescue you. In the Psalms of Ascent in Psalms chapter 126, there's a song that the people would sing to remind them of the promise to those who weep and wait on God to move and act. Look at Psalm 126. It says, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Our mouths were filled with laughter then, and our tongues with shouts of joy. Verse 5 says, those who sow in tears will reap with shouts of joy. And so not only for the nation of Israel, but to each of you in here this morning, no matter where you find yourself, might I encourage you that God will act and he will move. And it will be according to his timing and his way. We like it in our timing and our way often. Sometimes it is like Abraham and Sarah, where there's years of waiting and doubting and wrestling and wondering. But at the end of the day, God does move and act. He will visit us in our waiting, and he will fill us with laughter and shouts of joy. Your tears of grief and pain are not meaningless. Your cries of how long, O Lord, are not being prayed in vain. We're told that God sees and hears, and that he's actually storing up in a bottle all the tears of the saints. And it's through that they're sowing shouts of joy that will be reaped in the new creation someday, because God will do just as he said, just as he has promised at the appointed time that he has chosen. So in verses 1 through 6, we see that God is celebration for those who wait. And then in the next section, verses 7 through 21, we see that God is comfort for those who wander. So because the narrative of Genesis is based in human experience, you can't have much joy without finding brokenness. And the next section records brokenness showing up. In verses 8 through 10, in this happy moment, we read that Abraham is throwing a feast for Isaac after he had been weaned. And so in cultures such as these, the infant mortality rate was incredibly high. But if a young child reached the age of about 3, then their chances for survival went up quite a bit. And so often there would be a feast thrown. And so Isaac was probably around 3 years old. And what happens is at this feast, Sarah sees Ishmael, the child of works, mocking Isaac, the child of promise. So Ishmael would have been about 16 or 17 here. Sarah does not like what she sees from Ishmael, and so she says it's time for them to go. She tells Abraham that Sarah needs to be driven out. Now, this is strong language. It's coming for Sarah from a deeply emotional place. We've seen hers and Hagar's kind of tension. You can listen to past sermons about that. But she says here that Ishmael will have no part in the inheritance with Isaac. Again, so we hear the word slave and we think chattel slavery. In this culture, slavery often, even the child of the slave would eventually become the owner of the whole household. And so this was typical. Ishmael should have been next in line. He was the firstborn according to the ways of the culture. But God has made it clear that Isaac is through the promise, is through whom the promise will come through. And so what Sarah's doing here, though, does seem to be her trying to, again, protect the promise in her own strength. I mean, God's just provided, but she's got to step in and she's got to make sure that Isaac's role is going to be protected. In verses 11 through 13, we read that God actually allowed this to happen. Abraham, we didn't read these, but Abraham gets bothered by sending Hagar and Ishmael off, rightfully so, right? That's his son. So he gets bothered by that, but God says, he invites God into the wrestle, which I love, and God says for Abraham to listen to Sarah and send them off. Now, I want to be clear, this is not God agreeing with Sarah or affirming her motives. God has chosen to work with humanity, which means there are times where I'm actually amazed how often in Genesis God acquiesced to the human will, but he still chooses to work and move. So he's not agreeing with Sarah and affirming her motives, but what he is saying is telling Abraham, I will take over from here. I am not going, he immediately affirms, I am going to make Ishmael into a great nation, but Isaac is the child of promise. Remember, it was Abraham and Sarah that caused this whole mess, not God. This was Abraham and Sarah trying to work this out in their own strength, but God steps in and he's faithful to still bring comfort to those who are forced to wander. Hagar is presented as wandering in the wilderness. And the irony here is last chapter, Abraham was blaming God for making me wander. And now here, he and Sarah are making Hagar and her son wander in the wilderness. And so they wander until they run out of water. And then she sets her son under a bush and moves a ways off so she doesn't have to watch him die. But true to Ishmael's name, which means God hears, he hears the boy crying. He again calls Hagar by name for the first time in this text. Again, Sarah never referred to her by name, but God does. And he meets her for the second time in her distress. This is very similar to the last time we saw God meet Hagar. You can go back and listen to that sermon. I'm not going to repreach it. But here he says that he will care for the boy. He will make him into a great nation. And then he opens her eyes to see this well, which would have signified God's provision for them brought by grace alone. She didn't do anything to earn this well. It just shows up. And so she refreshes him. She gets to where they were going. And we're told this is really the last time we get a glimpse into Ishmael, except for seeing his lineage later, kind of in a more formal way, but as a part of the story. Sorry, my mic is catching on my beard and crackling, so I'm going to fix that. So what happens here, they get to where they're going and they survive to live a long, fruitful life. We're told that Hagar goes back to where she's from. Egypt gets him a wife, which would have just meant that, hey, he's about to start this family and this great nation. And so the story of Ishmael ends with us being told that God was with Ishmael, which is, if you read that in the Old Testament, that is an incredibly significant claim. And again, as we often see in Genesis, the stories don't fit into our neat theological categories sometimes, right? But remember, the purpose of Genesis is to teach us primarily about God and how he works. And the reality is God does not work in your neat little theological boxes often. And if the story of Ishmael and Hagar teaches us anything, it's that God brings comfort for those who are outcast and who wander in exile. The scriptures are abundantly clear that God is near to the oppressed. His ear is down towards the outcast and the downtrodden. And he sees them and he acts on their behalf. Again, this would have been good news to the people of Israel, who later will find themselves wandering in another wilderness because of their own disobedience. And they need God to show up and provide food and water, or else they will die. And they could read this story and know that God sees them. And it's good news for those of us today who find ourselves on the margins, struggling to survive and belong. Psalm 68, verse 5-6 says, God in his holy dwelling is a father of the fatherless and a champion of widows. God provides homes for those who are deserted. God says, Abraham, I've got this. And he takes the place of Abraham as Ishmael's father and Hagar's husband, caring for both of them. So if you find yourself discarded, poor, or often forgotten, be reminded that if no one else does, God sees you in your wandering. And he will provide a home for you, and you will be cared for. This week, one of my daughters, I won't say her name, and if you know who she is, don't talk to her about this because she'd be embarrassed, and she's not in here. But they had awards day at the school. And so out of all my kids, this one probably cares the most about awards day. And so she got dressed up, got up early in her nicest dress and fixed her hair, in the way she likes it best. and shows up to award day. And so we're sitting there and all the names are being called and keeps going on. And I see her kind of leaning over, talking to her friend. And I'm like wondering how she's going to handle this. And so her name never gets called is how it goes. And so I kind of see her over there and I'm just going to go tell her bye before I head on. And I see her head down and I didn't know if something had happened, but she's just, tears in her eyes and just trying to hold it in. And, and so I grabbed her, and of course I just grabbed her out of her line. I was like, hey, come here, let's talk. And so I'm like, okay, this is a gospel moment. This isn't a opinion about whether you should have awards day or not, or if everybody should get an award or not. That's not the point of this. Because reality is in that moment, she didn't care. She didn't care about, the philosophies of whether awards day are goods or bad, or what kind of, earning system should we have in the school system. All she cared about is she didn't feel seen. And so I grabbed her, and then of course I gave her a big old hug and just let her cry for a minute as her dad. And then I grabbed her by the face and I said, Everly, I want you to know, I don't care what anybody else says or if anybody else sees you. I need you to know that I see you. And I see all the beautiful and amazing things you are. And even more important than me seeing that, God sees it. And he loves you, and you are so valued in his eyes. And there are kids at the school who I saw crying who did not have a father there to support them for whatever reason. I'm not always able to be there. And that's why I tell my kids, ultimately, God is your real father. I'm here as a stand-in for a while. And I hope I model a little bit, but often I'll model what he's not. And I'll tell you that. God is not like that. He's not petty and he doesn't just lose his temper like I just did, right? But God is with you and he sees you. So through this story, we've seen that God is celebration for those who wait. He is comfort for those who wonder. And lastly, through the rest of the chapter, we see that God is confidence for those who wonder. So that's a different kind of wander. Hopefully you got that. Through the rest of the chapter, there's this story that when you first read it, it seems inserted out of nowhere, okay? I think as we go through it, you'll see its purpose. You heard portions of it read. I'm going to summarize it because we didn't read every little thing. But basically, you have Abimelech, who is the king of Gerar. He was introduced in chapter 20. So this where all this has been taking place. The last few years, Abraham's been dwelling here. So through this time, he has been seeing what's been going on in Abraham's life. He recognizes that a deity, he says, you're God, I want to be connected to this, so let's make a treaty. Now, Abraham was deceptive to King Abimelech a few years earlier, but in spite of that, he still wants to be connected to it. But he doesn't fully trust Abraham, right? Who would at this point? He had deceived Abimelech earlier, and so he says, I want you to swear to me your loyalty, right? Both now and through future generations by entering into this formal kind of covenant oath. And so Abraham swears that he will. And the part we didn't read, he also wants to deal with this elephant in the room. Hey, we can make this treaty, but I had this well that I spent a lot of time digging and your servants have seized it and I've not been able to use it. Wells in this culture, extremely valuable, right? Water was, they needed water to live, just like we do today, but it wasn't as accessible. And so he's like, we got to deal with this. And so as a part of this bigger treaty, Abraham gives Abimelech some flocks and herds, and he specifically pulls out what he says, 7 ewe lambs, as a verification that the well is actually his. So there's some culture stuff going on, but they make a covenant, and the story ends with Abraham planting a tree and calling on the name of the Lord, and then settling in the land of the Philistines for a while. So again, some cultural stuff we don't fully understand, but let me just try to explain the large purpose of some of it, and then we'll see how it ties in with our other stories. So first, one thing this is doing for the narrative in Genesis, it's showing that Abraham is claiming more land that God has promised him, and it's kind of a foreshadowing of Israel claiming it later. So he digs a well. That takes time, signified provision and sustenance. He makes a treaty with a neighboring king. He plants a tree, which is showing plans for more permanence. And it's also showing us Abraham calling on the name of the Lord. Anytime that phrase shows up in Abraham's life, it is significant. It is setting us up for his obedience in the next chapter that we'll see next week. But another thing I think the author is doing that's a little more subtle, but I'm going to try to explain it. He's strategically placing this story here to contrast some things for us. Okay, so one of the things that all commentators agree on and all biblical authors later will make clear that one of the things this chapter is doing is contrasting the child of promise, which is Isaac, with the child of works. So one, which is Isaac, comes through grace alone and brings laughter and joy. The other, Ishmael, comes through the striving and the works of man and brings division and pain and heartache. And so one of the things, so you have that contrast in the first two sections of this chapter, and then this passage of Abimelech is doing, it's further reinforcing that contrast and kind of bringing everything together. It mentions a well, which is also mentioned in Hagar's story, and it mentions an oath or a promise or a treaty, which the beginning of the chapter starts with the fulfillment of God's promise or oath. The word seven for ewe lambs and the word translated swear used over and over are almost identical in Hebrew. The name Beersheba means well of the oath or well of the sevens. We don't know exactly because they're so similar in the way they're spelled. And so all of this is being tied together. See, if you think about it, the well of Abraham here is earned by striving and bargaining and digging, and he's got to kind of maintain it and bargain with other humans to keep possession of it. But the well of Hagar was given by grace alone, by no work of man. She just opened her eyes, and actually God opened her eyes, and there it was. This story is also showing us the contrast between promises and oaths that are given among men, where they've got to kind of be bargained, and I don't really fully trust you, so let's kind of sign on the dotted line and make sure, because I don't really know if I can fully trust you, because I know my heart's pretty deceptive, so I know yours must be either, and so we're just kind of in this together. Versus the promises and oaths that are given by God. Genesis 21 starts with the fact that God did just as he said, just as he had promised, at the time he had promised. See, for those who find themselves doubting and wondering if God will really come through, this whole chapter serves as a reminder that God is trustworthy, and it's not on the basis of your goodness or you keeping up your end of the bargain, but rather simply on the basis of his character, by grace alone. He is our confidence for those of us who wonder if he will come through and if he will deliver. He is God and not man, so you don't have to hedge your bets and say, are you sure? His promises are always sure, and they're based on grace alone, not on the striving or earning of man. Later, the Apostle Paul will make use of this story as a clear allegory about the reality of the gospel being received by grace alone. See, we're like Abraham and we're like Sarah. We want to receive God's gifts and his goodness based on our own striving and our own earning. We want the credit. Let us figure it out. Let us be in control. We'll kind of protect and manage it no matter what we got to do. And the scriptures make it clear that that is not the gospel at all. Paul goes as far to call it another gospel. It's not even a gospel. It's anti-gospel. Look at how explicitly Paul says this, and he uses Genesis 21 to say it. Galatians 4, we'll have it on the screens. I'm going to read a lengthier portion. He's appealing to these people. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, don't you hear it? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave and the other by a free woman. But the one by the slave was born as a result of the flesh or works, while the one by the free woman was born through promise. Now, these things are being taken figuratively, so be clear. He's not trying to say Ishmael or Hagar weren't people of God or we won't see them in eternity someday. I actually think we will. I'm pretty convinced of that. He says, I'm using it as an illustration. For the woman represents two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai and bears children into slavery. That's the law, Mount Sinai. This is Hagar. Now, Hagar represents Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, the physical land. For she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. Verse 28, now you too, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as then the child born as a result of the flesh persecuted the one born as a result of the spirit, so also now. But what does the scripture say? Remember, he's speaking allegorically. He's using this to interpret it in how he wants. He says, drive out the slave and her son, for the son of the slave will never be a co-heir with the son of the free woman. Therefore, brothers and sisters, here's his point while he's using this story. We are not children of a slave, but of the free woman. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm then. How do we stand firm? Often we think stand firm in the law. No, stand firm then and don't submit again to a yoke of slavery. So don't overthink this. Again, Paul is using this allegorically, and he's simply saying that, look, the promises of God can only be received by grace alone. They cannot be earned by the striving of the flesh. As Paul said in another letter to the church at Corinth, all of God's promises find their yes in Jesus Christ. So for those who find themselves waiting in the darkness, wandering in the wilderness, and sitting in doubt, wondering if God will show up, the answer to all of your questions is Jesus. Galatians 4:3 says, in the same way we also, when we were children, we were in slavery under the elements of the world. But when the time came to completion, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then God has made you an heir. God is not selfish like Sarah. He has no problem sharing the full rights of the inheritance of Christ with us. See, in the story, we are all Ishmaels, sons and daughters of slavery, brought about through the flesh, through the earning and striving, living a homeless and a fatherless life. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, came in flesh to give us a home and a family. That's why you hear language of a dwelling place and family so often post-cross. We are invited into a new family. In an even greater miraculous birth than Sarah, at the appointed time, God visited, same language, the Virgin Mary, and used her womb to bring the true chosen one, the better Isaac, the son of promise, the savior of the world. And when Mary hears of these plans, her song echoes Sarah. She says, God has brought me rejoicing. He has looked on the lowly with favor. He has seen the outcast, the downtrodden, the forgotten one. And as this baby is born, he offers living water to all who have eyes to see. He came to call the outcast, the sinners, the downtrodden, the broken into his kingdom, where he stands with arms open, ready to receive them. As I was reading this story of Ishmael at a feast, mocking his younger brother, I was reminded of the parable that Jesus tells of another feast, where there was an older self-righteous brother who was incredulous that the younger prodigal brother could receive lavish grace. And Jesus tells this story to again make it clear that his kingdom is open to all who will enter by grace alone. You can't earn this. Hebrews tells us that when God makes an oath, he doesn't bring 7 ewe lambs because there's no one greater to make an oath by than himself. So he swears on this covenant by himself. And so when the way to redemption means that a death must occur, someone must become sin and carry that to the grave, Jesus is willing to become enslaved to sin and death to redeem prodigal sinners. Abraham offered up 7 ewe lambs. The number 7 signified perfection. And it was to ensure that he could have the water that he had earned and he had worked for. But Jesus offers up himself as the perfect lamb to ensure that we could have living water freely, not based on any striving or earning. He says, come, all who are thirsty, drink without price and drink freely and you'll never thirst again. This language of living water, we see it at the cross where Jesus' side is pierced and out rushes water and blood. He's the true well of life for all who believe. And on the 3rd day, he rises again. He beats death and the grave, and he's promised to return to complete the work. And so what do we do? That's always the question. What do we got to do? Just quit. Quit striving and earning and working and posturing and trying to protect every little thing you have. That's why Jesus says, lose your life so you can find it. Because as we surrender and instead trust in his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, we become children of the promise. We are freed from slavery to sin and instead welcomed into the family as joint heirs. Jesus freely shares the inheritance. That means we receive all the benefits of sonship that should have belonged to Christ alone. And so there's a lot of questions you might have, and I come in today with a lot. But through all the waiting, and through all the wandering, and through all the exile, through all the doubts and the questions, Jesus is our yes. His treaties, his promises, his oaths are not like man's because they are based in his character and he will always come through. So yes, with all the saints, we cry, how long, O Lord? We look at the world, whether it be brokenness out there or in our own hearts or in our circles, and we say, how long? This is a mess. Come, make things new. Please, how long, O Lord? When will you show up? When will you act? We cry, we ask. But one day, as Revelation 22 describes, with all the saints will stand and gaze on the Lamb slain, with sons and daughters that are brought in not based on ethnicity, but from all nations, tribes, and tongues, based solely on promise alone, brought into the family by grace alone, sitting by what we're told is a water of life that flows from the throne of the Lamb, with trees on either side for the healing of the nations, where we will sit and call on the name of the Lord forever together. Our Abba will throw a feast, and there will be no prideful older brothers, because all pride and sin will be cast outside the kingdom. Just full celebration. And this is our hope. And God will see to it that his promises will be kept. He will bring celebration, comfort, and confidence to our weary souls. I want to end by quoting a song. The name of it is Madness by Citizens. It says, sometimes I wish I never was born to feel the sting of a merciless world, the constant ache of all of this grief, pressing me down, but it's never defeat. Because when I've reached the end of my years, I'll lift from the grave and I'll bury my tears, and I will see you face to face with brand new eyes and a finished faith. This is the hope, and it's based in the work of Christ alone.